All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about China's technological and digital influence. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to briefly introduce Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit that is a platform for nonpartisan conversations about global affairs. We bring leading experts to have conversations about topics that are shaping our world, adding more nuance to discussions that are often reduced to misinformation and headlines. It is a great pleasure to welcome back to Network 2020 Adam Segal. He is the Ira Lippman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and the Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He recently spent just over a year as a senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, where he led the development of the Bureau's international policy. He is the author of The Hacked World Order: How Nations Fight, Trade, Maneuver, and Manipulate in the Digital Age, among many other publications, and he writes for the blog Net Politics. Welcome back, Adam.
Thanks for having me. I see I have to update my headshot there a little bit.
I think we all do. I think I'm about 20 years younger in mine. So. Um, Could you just start us off with an overview of the realm of technology and China's strategy and outlook when it comes to things like emerging technologies, the cyberspace realm, and data? And how does technology in general support other geopolitical and economic goals that China may have?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that technology is central to almost all of Xi Jinping's concerns for China. China is afraid it's going to get stuck in the middle income gap trap, so that it'll not be able to move up the value chain. So it wants to innovate in a range of critical emerging technologies. We've heard a lot about semiconductors and AI, but it's true for synthetic biology and advanced manufacturing, energy, and other places. Critical national security, as they think about how AI and quantum and others will be applied to military capabilities. Critical to influence, right? Not only how China shapes its message. China sees a lot of the soft influence, soft power that the United States gets from being the world's most innovative economy, right? Most entrepreneurs want to come to the United States. They want to set up their own company. There were lots of intelligence gains from everybody using American technology. The NSA became very familiar with those technologies and had a inside track in being able to hack them and gain information about that. So China wants that as well. And an important instrument of foreign policy through the Belt and Road Initiative and what's called the Digital Silk Road, providing digital infrastructure to developing economies. So we see that reflected the importance of all technology across the four areas, both domestically in investment in science technology, but also under Xi Jinping, a proliferation of policies around digital and cyber and AI. And then internationally, a range of foreign policy initiatives where China has basically tried to promote itself as a force for innovation and technological change.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that overview. I wanted to just spend a little bit of time because China's not operating in a vacuum. It's a global world. Um, I'd like to just contrast a little bit China's approach to that of the United States. We had a speaker about a year ago, Anu Bradford, who wrote the book Digital Empires, and she was talking about how, at least in the cyber realm, there's almost a battle over how different parts of the world are approaching it, where Europe's a leader in regulation, the US prefers this sort of Silicon Valley private sector driven approach, and China has this state run model. Do you think her take is a fair assessment? And sort of how do you see this shaping up when you're looking at China's approach versus the US approach? And are there different inflection points that might determine the direction in which the world heads?
Yeah, I do. I think, as I think Anu herself admits that those are, broad typologies and that there are ways that each of them mirror and reflect each other. But I think it is fundamentally true that yes, the American technology system grew out of essentially a bottom-up entrepreneurial, fairly laissez-faire approach to regulation. I mean, of course, all those technologies came out of U.S. Investment through the National Science Foundation and through DARPA and other places. China has been much more state-driven, but and Europe has, tried to use the EU regulations to shape the emergence of digital technologies through the GDPR, the General Decision on Privacy Regulation, as well as the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act. But I think what we're seeing is that each of the kind of three blocks sees that just relying on this one kind of kind of majority perspective, or this kind of one dominant view, is not enough in this increasing contentious competition, and that they all have to adopt different parts of the other models. So, Europe very much wants to have its own tech firms, and it is trying to figure out how it encourages innovation. And there was a report last month from the Italian foreign prime minister, where he essentially said, we have to start thinking about deregulation to encourage innovation. The U.S. is thinking more about industrial policy and what role the state can play to try to ensure that we're competitive with China on a range of technologies. And China has always had a bottom-up approach, right? I mean, in some ways, Tencent, Alibaba, the companies that we know as the digital platforms in China were all essentially private. They grew in a space that was not where the state was active. And so I think we're seeing some ways that the models are converging.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. How, in your opinion, has the U.S. China relationship in technology and the cybersecurity domains evolved, particularly as the bilateral relations have shifted from what was more of a cautious engagement approach to one that's more of strategic competition?
Yeah, I think, we've seen two interrelated things happening. One is that the the global model of technology, right, where R&D for the most part happened in the United States, and then manufacturing was sent to Asia and to China in particular. That model was increasingly questioned by both the U.S. and by China, right? The U.S. Because manufacturing became hollowed out, we became worried about transferring technology to China. We became worried about intellectual property theft. The Chinese, because they wanted to move up the value chain and wanted to make sure that they were doing more research and development and their own innovation. And closely related, that on the cyber side, both sides became worried that those vulnerabilities and connections could be exploited for cybersecurity gains or for cybersecurity attacks or data collection. Now, it all dates around to the same time. You can, China has been talking about increasing autarky and autonomy and technology from at least 2005, if not 1890, but we'll start from 2005. But then all of that was really accelerated under Xi Jinping in 2012, 2013. Some of that had to do with the Snowden revelations. So when Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor, started disclosing the kind of scope of NSA operations, China doubled down on wanting to remove American technology from the stack. So, could they replace IBM with Inspur? Could they replace Cisco with Huawei, which they thought they would make their technology stack more secure? And from the U.S. perspective, we saw this acceleration of first in 2005 was the Indigenous Innovation Plan, but then under China, the Made in China 2020-25 plan, which seemed again to say China was going to dominate a number of critical technologies. And so under the first Trump administration, you saw both the use of export controls, but also talks about how we can invest in our own capabilities. And now we really have, in some ways, a kind of spiral of actions where the two sides are often mirroring each other and kind of using export control or investment and reacting to each other, that make technology and science cooperation very difficult.
Right. Thank you. Um, I'd like to just shift a little bit away from the US and talk about China's investment in digital infrastructure across the global south. How has that been affecting its geopolitical influence? And what about China's digital policies and data management practices? And how has China's approach in general affected their standing among both countries in the global south and other countries around the world?
Yeah, so it's been a very large part of China's outreach to the developing world. As I mentioned, kind of as Belt and Road initiatives, the large infrastructure projects face some pushback from some of those developing countries because of the environmental cost or because of the debt that was needed, or some redundancy in infrastructure. China saw digital projects as being a good substitute. They require less investment, and so we've seen that, Huawei and ZTE in particular have been extremely important in helping build out telecommunication structures, so third generation 3G and 4G communications through Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, companies like Alibaba and Tencent and others have built data infrastructure and data centers in places like Malaysia along the corridor for the Belt and Road Initiative. There have been some concerns about data safety and security. The U.S. very loudly under the Trump administration and also under the Biden administration, tried to make the argument that, Chinese technology was inherently less secure, that the data would end up in the hands of, Chinese intelligence agencies, and that would be a reason for why developing countries should not choose Chinese technology. The security argument itself was not particularly effective with those countries. I think for several reasons. I mean, one is that for most of those countries and the leaders, their primary concern is addressing the digital divide and building infrastructure as quickly as possible. Chinese products were, especially around 4G telecommunications and 5G, were at least a third cheaper than the Western substitutes, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung as well. And so if I'm, going to build out infrastructure, cost is the most important thing. And the spying arguments weren't really that relevant to these countries, right? If I'm the president of Ghana, I'm pretty much going to assume I'm going to get spied on by China and the US no matter what I do. So I might as well at least have I might as well at least have the infrastructure as quickly as possible. The US government tried to moderate its discussions to kind of talk about longer term costs, not just the kind of immediate cybersecurity costs, but some of the longer term costs. There were some cases where data did seem to be flowing back to China that did alienate some users in Africa, for example. But it's still extremely important for the U.S. and the like-minded that if they're going to compete with China on technology, you really have to be on the ground and you really have to provide practical solutions to these development problems.
As a follow-on to that, what about the TikTok debate in the United States? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, although who knows how it's going to kind of play out under the next Trump administration. But my argument has always been, I was certainly more concerned about TikTok as a threat on information and disinformation than I was on kind of data collection. And most of my concerns about TikTok were the concerns I have about all types of social media, not necessarily TikTok in particular. Now, again, there was, a lot of reporting about where TikTok was saying the data was stored and had and who had access to it, and that turned out to be not true. That in fact, some people in China and Chinese managers had access to that data, and so all of those things I think needed to be addressed and needed to be investigated. And but fundamentally, the amount of data that you could collect from TikTok to spy on American citizens, we already know that, through the hack of the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and Anthem Health, and Marriott, Equifax, plus all the data that you can buy publicly through third-party data brokers, you're not gaining anything particularly useful from TikTok. Now, the influence, social media distortion is probably more concerning, as younger people get more of their news from social media. And there were reports, right, of users who were talking about Hong Kong democracy and cultural genocide against the Uyghurs, that those were being downplayed. Again, those need to be addressed, but we have such bad transparency about how all of social media's algorithms work. I would put it in those categories.
Right, right. It's sort of a challenge that runs across the board. Speaking of challenges that run across the board, you mentioned some of these data hacks that have happened. Using that as a jumping off point, are there specific areas such as cybersecurity or an AI where you see potential for U.S. China cooperation despite this broader climate of rivalry?
Yeah, it's very hard in the cyberspace because most cyber actions are espionage, right? Are breaking into networks and trying to steal information for political or military purposes. And the US does the same, and there is no, in fact, international law against espionage. And after the hack of the OPM, the DNI at the time, James Clapper, the director of national intelligence at the time, basically said, I kind of tip my hat to the Chinese. That's the kind of target we'd go after as well. Now, we tried to argue to the Chinese that stealing military secrets is not the same as stealing industrial secrets, right? So the other big push for China is stealing intellectual secrets from companies. There was about a year where the Chinese seemed to agree with on that. There was President Obama and Xi Jinping announced an agreement to that neither side would do that, but after a year, the Chinese went back to doing that. So they never really seemed to intend to follow through on that. So espionage, probably we will never have an agreement. Now, more destructive, disruptive attacks in which the Chinese seem to be preparing for, and people may have seen in the news, the U.S. government talking about operations they're calling Volt Typhoon or Salt Typhoon or Flax Typhoon, where the Chinese seem to be um, pre-positioning themselves in critical networks in the United States in case there's a military conflict across the Taiwan Straits, so they can launch attacks that would either slow U.S. responses down or cause social chaos, or basically try to deter the United States from becoming involved in a Taiwan scenario. Those types of cyber scenarios we may be able to have discussions with the Chinese about, in the sense of you really want both sides to understand what the red lines would be, right? Because you don't want to have a cyber hack unintentionally escalate into kinetic or physical conflict. So we tried several times with the Chinese to have conversations about what we think the rules of the law around this are. The US has said we think international law applies and the laws of armed conflict applies. China has sometimes said it thinks it applies, sometimes it says it doesn't think it applies. But you really want to have some understanding of what those red lines might be. That would be extremely useful, and I think there are some shared incentives there. On AI, we've managed to have a couple of discussions under the Biden administration about AI regulation and concerns about frontier models and existential risks. The Chinese were present at this international process called the Bletchley Park process, which the British first sponsored, and then went to Seoul and then to is going to France in 2025. If I remember correctly, they did sign the first agreement. Um, there were two resolutions in the UN, a US one that the Chinese signed off on, and then a Chinese one that the US signed off on, that are, have a lot of the same language. And we just know from the meeting between President Xi and President Biden in Peru this week that they both said we shouldn't use AI for nuclear command and control systems, right? There always should be a human involved. So there are some areas where there clearly some shared interest to talking about AI development.
And it sounds like most of those are happening in sort of the multilateral space. Is that a correct assessment?
Multilateral, except for this bilateral discussion on AI.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, great, thank you. And just as a reminder to those who are listening, I will turn to the audience pretty soon for questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to just put it in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many as I can. Adam, looking at China's digital power, how do you see it comparing to its traditional economic influence? And is this just an extension of their economic power, or is it really a distinct tool?
Uh, I think and very much as an extension of Chinese economic power and Chinese statecraft. There was a brief period where the tech firms and the digital platforms themselves seemed more independent of the Chinese party, China Communist Party, and the Chinese state. And we saw this, what was called the tech lash inside of China, right? Where the head of Alibaba, Jack Ma, disappeared. He was called in for a discussion. Many of the other leaders of the big Chinese companies, Pony Ma and others, stepped back. They adopted new philanthropic pursuits that totally overlapped with what Xi Jinping wanted to do. Um, and so we've kind of, that independent space has kind of, I think, narrowed a lot, and they are very much voicing the concerns of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. But I think all technological power does have a kind of soft power impact on it. Part of that is um, uh, through standards, right? How the technologies are developed and how they're implemented, right? So we know that when countries build out their digital infrastructure, if they, Western firms have one sense about how open those infrastructures should be, Chinese firms have another. And we know the Chinese have trained people, from the developing economies about how to control technology and manage information on the internet. Parts of Chinese cybersecurity laws have just been clipped and pasted and used in Vietnam and some other places. So there is, I think, a soft power influence that also comes from it.
Thank you. Looking ahead, well, back a little bit and then ahead, how has the Trump administration's approach toward China on tech and cybersecurity issues shaped the current dynamics? And what do you foresee from Trump's second term policies when it comes to China and technology?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of consistency on tech and cyber from Trump to Biden, right? I mean, the Trump administration, we can, kind of leave the president and some of his tweeting on the side because he was mixed messaging around Huawei and TikTok and things like that. But the administration itself was fairly consistent about, using export controls to try and slow Chinese development down, confronting China on the cyber issues, and trying to get other countries not to use Chinese technology. And the Biden administration, ramped up the export controls, right? So made the restrictions around um, semiconductors even tighter. Um, uh, Added some new controls around the outward flow of investment capital into semiconductors and AI and other critical technologies. It moderated the arguments somewhat about using Chinese tech, but our focus when I was in the State Department was still trying to convince other countries not to use Chinese tech. And try to push back on China on these cyber issues. I suspect all of these big themes will continue with Trump too. The difference will be the tools. In particular, the Biden administration very much stressed using allies and stressed international organizations and trying to make the best of the UN. Now, the Biden administration had a skepticism about what could be accomplished at the UN, but still thought it was pretty important to try and shape what was going on there, in part because the argument was, well, if the United States is not present there, then the Russians and Chinese can do whatever they want. And so I suspect that both on the alliance side and the kind of institutional UN side, the Trump administration is more likely to go it alone and to be more confrontational with China, especially on cyber, perhaps to use more of the defense options than the Biden administration did, although the Biden administration also did some operations, although we're not really clear what they were.
Okay, great. That is a good segue actually into our first question. And again, if you're listening and you have a question, please feel free to just put it in the Q&A box. We have a question here, and the questioner is asking, which companies do you envision that China is most likely to target to cripple or impact the US economy as a counterweight to US sanctions or other strategies against China?
Yeah, I mean the most interesting question will be what happens to Tesla, right? Given the dependence of Tesla on the Chinese market, both to sell into and for batteries, and the close relationship between Musk and the president, seems like it would be an obvious place where if the Chinese wanted to exert some pressure that they could do it. Now that may not be, there's a whole all degrees of pressure, right? In cases, sometimes Chinese have held visiting CEOs for 3 hours at the airport. They may do an investigation on tax and raid in an office. So that's happening. Clearly, I think on rare earths, already we've seen some pressure being used on that. Will be that they'll use that. Intel has been targeted. Most recently, the Cybersecurity Administration of China has suggested that Intel products need to be inspected. They haven't followed through, but that's there. Micron has already been inspected by the CAC, by the Cyberspace Administration of China. And then Apple would be another obvious target that the Chinese could go after.
Great, thank you. Another question, how does Chinese cyber policy influence the domestic policies of neighboring states? I think you touched on this a little bit, but it'd be great if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think it depends where the states stand on the kind of openness to the internet and how open they want to be and what they learn from China. Also, how much technology of their own they have, and do they feel that the Chinese are likely to try and steal it? And then also, do they have any border disputes with China? That is, a very important predictor. So on the technology side, and also the economic relationship, South Korea and Japan have been being hacked by China for at least 20 years. But for the most part, both countries never called China out. Right? They wouldn't attribute an attack to Chinese hackers. And that has changed over the last 5 years. Now we both see China and Japan and South Korea saying, oh, these are Chinese hackers. If you look at the strategies of both countries, they now explicitly mention hackers from China. And so the domestic strategies on that side are moving forward. Similarly, if you have a border dispute or a maritime dispute with China, you're much more likely to take a more vocal stand towards China and Chinese hacking. So Philippines, again, victim under Duarte, pretty much ignored it. But now under Marcos Jr., where he is pushing back on South Sea China claims, we see a lot closer cooperation with the United States on cyber issues. And India, with its border dispute, was willing to ban, TikTok and 20 or 30 other Chinese apps after the violent clash at Galwan, and is more likely now to again call out China than it was before.
Great. Um, More broadly, what role do you see US academia and NGOs playing in staying connected to China?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely important and will be extremely important. One of the so the China initiative, which started under the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration decided not to continue, although there was still a pretty large hangover about investigating Chinese or Chinese-born scientists in the States about their connection to talent plans in the in China. So it had a pretty uh, negative impact on cooperation between scientists in both countries. And most recently, there was a study that I'm blanking on who did it, but looking at joint papers between the U.S. and China. They've gone down, and that's pretty much affected innovation in the United States. It has a pretty negative effect there. Biden administration did not continue with the China initiative, but was still very concerned about scientists from what are called the Seven Sons, so the universities that are tied to the Chinese military. And there's certainly a lot of, I think, probably self restraint that if you're a Chinese scientist or an American scientist, you are thinking that you don't want to draw attention to yourself. And the U.S. and China S&T agreement has been renewed, but but only in these 6-month chunks. It hasn't been completely resigned. So NGOs and academia in that space are going to, I think, be extremely important in supporting person-to-person connections. Now, it's extremely important on the Chinese side too, right? Because the amount of publicly available data has significantly been reduced on the Chinese side, like what's available on the web. And uh, Chinese laws themselves have talked about concerns about spying and interacting with foreigners. So there's been a shadow cast over it on the Chinese side as well. So I think there's a large role to play as long as both sides are important and um, are careful and pay attention to the potential security risks.
What impact do you think that, you mentioned the number of, say, co-author papers declining and whatnot. What impact do you think that will have more broadly in the realm of science and technology for both countries?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, but I think probably a pretty good bet that the overall pace of innovation will go down. I mean, it depends on what sectors and how globalized that sector was in the first place, but artificial intelligence was extremely global. The connections between US and China were very, very uh, um, broad and deep. And so disentangling that, I think, probably slow innovation. Now, there may be other things where they're less tied up, and if they're seen to have a national security role, that more money might flow into them, and you could see innovation speeding up. But I think overall, probably the overall rate will go down.
Next question. The questioner writes, China has many advantages over the United States. One, it's much larger and hardworking and less expensive labor force. And two, its brightest technology students are sent abroad. About, they write 250,000 in the US and versus 250 Americans in China. I cannot verify these independently, but is this a risk for the US?
Yes, I mean, it's always been a risk that uh, China has a larger population. Like, there's no way eventually the United States cannot compete on scale with China. Now, there's all been questions about how can you match a Chinese engineer with a US engineer based on training and expertise? That was probably a bigger question 15 or 20 years ago, maybe the last time I was at um, Network 2020 talking about another book on innovation. And, we know that Chinese education and training on these things have gotten much, much better. And certainly the best students at Tsinghua and Fudan and those places are as competitive as the best undergraduates at MIT and other things. There's no doubt about it that one of the US's great strengths has been the ability to attract scientific talent from China and India and the rest of the world, and keep them here. Because people wanted to stay here. That changing is, I think, a long-term risk for the United States, and that people wanting to return, both for political reasons, but also for personal reasons and economic reasons, is a threat to kind of how U.S. innovation has traditionally worked. Right, there's lots of people talking about improving STEM education, and but those are long-term fixes. They take decades, and we've been talking about it for decades. So immigration is the fastest solution to that, and so getting that right would be extremely important.
Great. The flip side of that, this next questioner writes that every now and then they'll see articles and publications like the South China Post that proclaim, a new Chinese scientific development, such as fusion power or, something quantum related. How credible are these sources, the questioner asks, and how should media consumers think about Chinese scientific accomplishments?
With a grain of salt. I mean, there is a lot of cheerleading in the Chinese press right now about some breakthroughs that are um, probably not, as close to the edge as the reporting seems to suggest, or sometimes in spaces where the US has decided it actually doesn't make a lot of scientific sense to follow through on that side. So quantum is a good example of that. So the Chinese, are ahead in quantum communication, so using quantum mechanics to send messages, and as well as what's called quantum key distribution, so which is a way of encryption. But essentially, the US decided that those were two solutions to problems that we didn't think quantum was useful for. We're probably significantly ahead on quantum computing. And so I would take the reporting with a grain of salt, but it's close enough to the truth that when you look at studies done in the US, mapping the list of what the US says are critical and emerging technologies, there's a fair number of them, and I don't remember the most recent one where China is in the lead. Of the 35, 20 some or something like that, China was in the lead, or a close follower. So the general specifics may sometimes be off, but the general trend is probably right.
Thank you for that clarification. Next question is, what are your thoughts on Taiwan just announcing plans to spend $3 billion in AI, of which cyber is likely to be a component?
Right. So the Taiwanese have a lot of obviously pressure on them, both from Xi Jinping and the increasing military and diplomatic pressure on Taiwan, but also a huge amount of uncertainty about what's going to happen under the under the Trump administration. Right. So the Biden administration this week or last week has been trying to get money, the CHIPS money, which is to support manufacturing inside the United States, out the door, to get it to TSMC, the Taiwanese manufacturer, to move more manufacturing to the United States, to Phoenix and other places. Now, Trump himself has said, Taiwan should pay more for its own defense, and the CHIPS Act is not a good idea because it's giving money to the biggest companies. I think many people who will be in his administration don't agree with him about that, and are likely to support both Taiwan and the CHIPS Act. But Taiwan is going to, I think, double down on trying to also figure out if it can um, get a little maneuver space between the United States and China. Part of that is through what's sometimes called sovereign AI. So how do you develop your own AI systems, because it's dominated by U.S. companies? And so we see Singapore, Taiwan, a number of other countries trying to develop their own language models. So in Southeast Asian language models, or in Mandarin or other Taiwanese language models, and trying to make sure that they have their own independent capabilities.
All right, thank you. What role do private companies play in shaping the US response to China's growing influence in the digital sphere?
That is a great question that I am supposedly writing a book about, that I wish I was farther along on. So I think you kind of have to break it down into sectors, and um, to some extent, we are seeing more and more companies aligning with U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. We see that in a very narrow set of technologies that are, very, very military focused. So, companies like Palantir or Anduril, which, manufactures drones and things, and they are, almost explicitly saying, we're part of the fight for democracy, and others. Um, Other companies often use the risk of China to push back against regulation. So we saw Meta and Facebook do it almost a decade ago, and we see OpenAI and Microsoft and others still doing it now, saying, look, if you regulate us too intensely, especially around AI, China will take the lead, and that'll be bad for democracy and for freedom. And OpenAI just released a blueprint that talks about their role in defending democracy, and the Biden administration 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago released a national security memo on AI and the importance of the private sector. And days after, OpenAI and Anthropic and Llama, which is the open source software from Meta, all said, we're going to play a larger role in defense and intelligence uses. So I think we're seeing a lot of that there, and kind of framing that in um, national security or U.S. foreign policy interests. Now, the big question, though, is if push comes to shove, right? If there's a conflict across the straits, and would companies play the same role that they did defending Ukraine, right? Microsoft, Google, all for a long time provided pro bono services, or defended networks, provided cloud services. Starlink, at the beginning was providing services, but those countries had very, very little exposure to Russia. And China is really a whole different set of challenges for them, and that, I think, is really an open question. We just don't know if they'll make different calculus. They'll see a different calculus for those decisions on their bottom lines.
And just as follow-up, I mean, that I feel like almost goes back to one of the earlier questions I set out, which is looking at these different models, where China's is more state-run and the US has a lot happening in the private sector. Are there other advantages or disadvantages you see playing out in that system as private companies have more, where there's just more overlap between what private companies do and what's happening in the foreign policy realm?
I mean, there is the advantage that, the CCP can pretty much tell the companies what to do. And so there is unlikely to be as much gap as there is sometimes between U.S. foreign policy and some of the tech companies in the United States. The question, though, is, as the Communist Party and the state have exerted greater control over the private sector, what's that going to do to their innovative capabilities longer term? Right. So we've seen pretty much a collapse of venture capital inside of China right now, as there's just a huge amount of uncertainty about how China is going to develop. The Chinese government has tried to signal that no, it's going to continue to support private entrepreneurs, but nobody is buying that right now. And the firms themselves are kind of uncertain about, are they going to overstep the boundaries? We saw that in the the first generation of kind of chat GPT, China was the United States was so far ahead, and China actually had some difficulty catching up, in part because of political concerns, right? The Chinese companies were really worried about what the bots would say about, Xi Jinping and other things. So they had to do tighter controls. Now that gap is closed as the Chinese companies has figured that out. So there are going to be innovation impacts that close um, relations have that we have to worry less about.
Thank you. Next question. Kishore Mahbubani, in his recent book, The Asian Century, an undiplomatic memoir, says that China's rise is inevitable, and instead of where did this go? And instead of fighting this, we should try to adapt and mold this to our mutual advantage. Do you agree?
I don't believe inevitable, and we tried molding and engaging, which I think was the right bet in some ways, but that did not work in the ways that we expected. And I also think that we're talking about a different situation with Xi Jinping. I just think then he's clearly a different category of leader that came from before him, and the ability to shift incentives inside the Chinese system. It seems to me we have very few levers as do China's neighbors. So I really think we are about trying to blunt what China is able to accomplish in the shorter term. And I don't think China's rise, I mean, there is a lot, there is a very vociferous debate right now about if China has plateaued and, what it's going to happen in the future. But I do think there are just so many challenges facing China right now between demographics and innovation, rural poverty, healthcare, all these things that, it would probably be wrong to think that it's inevitable. Now, do I think China's going to stumble dramatically anytime soon? Probably not. But um, I would not want to predict what's going to happen in 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the truth is usually somewhere in between. Next question is, how does China's cyber policy intersect with its diplomatic and strategic goals in the Middle East, particularly in relation to Israel and the ongoing conflict in the region? Could China's technological partnerships or cyber initiatives in the Middle East influence its role as a mediator or stakeholder in the conflict?
Yeah, I think China has been trying to walk that line. So it for a while was very actively engaging Israel on technology issues. The U.S. had concerns about that around infrastructure as well. Israel sometimes listened to the U.S. and sometimes did not on those concerns, but over time has been more willing to kind of think about U.S. concerns about technology, in part because some of the framing and the language that China has used about Hamas and the October 7th war. China also is looking to the Gulf states as technology partners. We have this very interesting and complicated case of G42, which is a AI company in the Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates. It had a lot of connections to China. It wants to do more business with Microsoft. There is an agreement that's been signed that's going to allow that to go forward as long as G42 reduces its ties to China and Chinese technology. So I think, again, it depend on some of the Gulf states, but I think they're going to, especially with Trump coming in, a lot of the Gulf states will see a more engaged partner than they did under the Biden administration. So they may swing farther away from China. And that may open some space for some kind of more technological competition between them and the United States.
Thank you. I think I can get in a couple more questions. So How do you see the growing U.S. China technological rivalry impacting global cooperation on issues like climate change and health security?
Not well. I mean, it's pretty negative in the sense of, from a climate perspective, you'd want to be producing new energy, batteries, and solar panels and other things as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible, so you could, replace fossil fuels with new energy sources. But as countries around the world, not just the U.S., but the EU and others, push back against Chinese overcapacity, that's going to have an effect on affecting reaching some of these climate change things. Same with vaccine production and dispersion. That you'd want the two sides to be able to cooperate and disperse them as quickly as possible. So under the Trump administration with tariffs and other things, I suspect it will we'll see kind of competing blocks. The kind of US will do its own thing. China will partly do its own thing, but will also use the language of still being a global player, and use the language of um, in the climate change agreements, even if it on the side is not following through. And then, the like-minded EU and others will try to do their own thing.
One questioner wants to follow up on what you had alluded to earlier about the demographic situation. How is China's demographic situation likely to impact their overall strategy, particularly in the technological realm?
I mean, it it strengthens the importance of it. It heightens the importance of the technology side of things because the working class population has peaked, right, and they're now have now moved through. And so both kind of from a technological perspective that you have to replace workers, through robotics and others, that is one of the reasons why they, want to rely more on the technology. Also, they hope that technology can address some of the issues of the aging population, um, you know, either through care or medical breakthroughs or other things there. So it really increases the pressure on the kind of some of the economic drivers for technological innovation.
Right. And we have here Germany's defense minister said that Taiwan will become part of China, comparing Taiwan to the prodigal son who was lured home. Do you, and so it sounds like they're alluding to a non-violent reunification. Do you think this is an inevitable, particularly as Taiwan semiconductors become less critical for the US?
I do not. I mean, I don't see what political deal the current Chinese leadership can offer to Taiwan to make it attractive to the Taiwanese people to return to, well, to unify with China, not to return. Um, the big issue, of course, is what's happened in Hong Kong, right? So that was one country, two systems, and as I suspect many people saw this week the jail sentences for democracy activists in Hong Kong are only going to reinforce the message in Taiwan that the Taiwanese democracy and way of life would not be protected under the one country, two system. And Xi Jinping has offered nothing other than that. And so I don't see how Taiwan moves forward. Now, could China invade? That's kind of a different question. That militarily is becoming more possible as Chinese capabilities increase. It would still be extremely risky. Amphibious invasion across the straits is not going to be easy. We don't really know how, Taiwanese resistance will it be like Ukraine, or will it be like something else? We don't we don't really know. But the costs would be astronomical to the world economy. So I don't think it's inevitable. I hope it's not by force. And I would hope that the Chinese leadership in particular would become more creative about what type of political incentives they could offer to the Taiwanese people to make some type of unification more attractive.
Okay. And last question. Would you mind commenting on the relationship between China and Russia? And in particular, one, is there a role for China in the Ukraine-Russia negotiations? And two, what are your thoughts on the detention of a Chinese vessel on the undersea cable
Oh, yeah.
cutting that just happened in the Baltic Sea?
Yeah, I don't think China has much of a role. I mean, Russia doesn't, I mean, Ukraine doesn't take China seriously as an independent actor, and the Europeans don't take China seriously as an independent actor, especially as we've seen, China's support on providing access to chips and other things that Russia needs for the force. I think there has been some overlap, on this. Cable sea cutting. There was an earlier one, I think, also that a Chinese trawler was involved in. That China seems, happy to kind of play a role in helping China on some of the sabotage things. But I don't want to overstep how far that cooperation could go. I mean, both sides are still going to be somewhat worried about each other and relative power. China and Russia about a decade ago signed what they called a cyber treaty that was in the West was interpreted as a no hack treaty that they wouldn't, but then they proceeded to hack each other, days, months after the agreement was signed, and they continue to hack each other. We know that Chinese groups go after Russia, trying to figure out what's going on with the war, and the Russians do the same to China. So I think there's going to be some level of skepticism there, but the subsea cable stuff is pretty interesting and pretty worrying if it does in fact turn out to be this Chinese trawler.
All right. Well, on that note, Adam, thank you very much. You have given us just a wonderful tour around so many different topics, and given your highlighting of the book that you're working on. We, hope we can have you back once that is all finished. Just a few housekeeping announcements for those who are listening. We do have some upcoming events. One in person, we'll be talking to Mark Linscott, a former assistant U.S. trade representative, about the future of trade. And that will be in person for members on December 10th in New York. And so you are welcome to join as a member if you would like. It is also our giving season. So we do encourage people to donate to support Network 2020. We rely almost entirely on individual donations. So whether it's through a membership or a donation, we really appreciate any support we can get. And we will be announcing a couple other virtual events, I believe, for December that should be coming up as well. So Adam, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you back. We wish you all a happy Thanksgiving as well.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.